Smooth away from the tribe. Oh yeah, we're in Soulfield.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Step for us as we wait up on the.
Hi guys, and welcome back to the Online Music School, dedicated to producing music content for your training and development. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and in the meantime, hit like and subscribe. Okay, welcome back to the Online Music School. Amen. Okay, so we're going to just take the time today to go through intervals, okay, and this is the next stage in your learning. Now, we've looked at major scales and playing the major scales, and that kind of somewhat gives us a foundation into understanding of melody in terms of the movements of notes from point A to point B, so C to D, D to E, E to F, F to G, okay? Now these themselves are actually examples of intervals, and you may remember from one of the earlier videos that I actually mentioned the word interval. But today I'm going to explain the concept a little bit more and go into more detail. Okay, so what you have here is you have essentially two different categories of intervals which we use in music. The first category is called melodic intervals, and that's anything that involves notes which play at different points in time. And what do I mean by that? If you imagine a line, okay, and we have single notes playing at different points across that line, okay, that's what we call a melodic interval, or what we commonly understand and know as melody. So for example, if I take the song Mary Had a Little Lamb, and I just play the melody, okay, and here we see the perfect example of a melodic interval. There's different notes playing at different moments in time, okay, and there is still distance between the notes, okay, so we maintain the fact that they are intervals, but they're just moving intervals, they move, okay. Then we have another category of intervals called harmonic intervals, okay, and what these are, again, if we imagine our line, okay, and let's say at the first point when a note is played, then instead of playing a single note, let's imagine we stack notes on top of each other, okay? And this is what happens across the line. We have notes that are stacked across the line. Now, each stack is what we would call a harmonic interval. It's a cluster or a stack of notes which are played at the same point in time. So the same song, and I'm gonna add some harmonic intervals or some harmony to it to give you an idea of what we're talking about. So these are the two categories of intervals we have. Okay, so what is an interval? An interval is the space or the distance between any two notes in music, okay? So you can have an interval from C to D, for example. Okay, that's an interval. You can have an interval from D to F. That's an interval. Any distance that can be measured on the keyboard. You can have an interval from C to the next E flat, not the immediate E flat, the next E flat, that's also an interval, okay? And these intervals are used to compile chords and compile melody, as I've explained earlier, okay? So what's the relevance of this, okay? So I'm gonna break it down, and we're gonna use the C major scale to help us understand this, okay? So in the key of C, if we start off on just C, okay, you'll find that first of all, C in itself is an interval, and this is a harmonic interval called unison. Okay, then we have C and D together. That's an interval which we call, it's a second interval. C and E is your third interval. C and F is your fourth. Now these intervals, of course, they're reflecting the actual distance in terms of number. So C to F is the space of 1, 2, 3, 4 notes. So it's your fourth interval in the key of C major. Whereas if we change this interval and we create that interval in the key of F major, okay, now it becomes your fifth interval, okay, because it's from F to C, and the distance in the key of F major is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay? So this is just to kind of illustrate how intervals can change up depending on what key or what degree you play them in. Okay, so these intervals now are characterized into groups or categorized into groups, okay? So the first two groups I'm going to focus on are what we call major intervals and perfect intervals, okay? And in any major key, you divide, of course, there are 8 intervals that I showed you, the first, the unison, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh, and the octave, okay? And these 8 intervals, 4 of them belong to the major interval category, and 4 of them belong to the perfect interval category, okay? So I'm going to go through the perfect intervals first. Okay, so C or by itself or unison is a perfect interval. Okay, and C and F, which is your fourth, is a perfect fourth interval. C and G, which is a fifth, is your perfect fifth interval. And octave, or perfect octave or perfect eighth, is also a perfect interval. So these are the 4 perfect intervals, okay? Which leaves us with your second, which is going to be a major second interval, so that's C to D. C to E is going to be your major third interval. C to A is your major sixth interval. And C to B is your major seventh interval. So here we have 4 major intervals and 4 perfect intervals. Okay. Now these intervals evolve a little bit further, okay, it moves to a category which we call chromatic intervals, okay. Now these chromatic intervals consist of 3 individual types of interval. You have your minor interval, you have your diminished interval, and you have your augmented interval. And I'm very quickly going to go through that before we end the lesson. Okay, so let's take our perfect fourth, for example, okay? Actually, let's take our major third, for example, okay? Now, if we want to change this major interval into a minor interval, all we do, okay, is we have to shorten the distance by a half step, okay? So the distance is 1, 2, 3, okay, and we're shortening the distance by a half step or a semitone. Now, if you remember from the second video, that semitone distance is just a half step downwards. So we move from E to E flat, okay? Now what we have is C and E flat, and this is what we would call our minor third interval. Okay, this is our minor third interval, okay? And simply put, you can create a minor interval by decreasing any major interval by a half step. So if we decrease the distance of any of our major intervals by a half step, we get a minor interval. So this is our major second, that's our minor second. Major third, minor third. Major sixth, minor sixth. Major seventh, minor seventh. Okay? That's our minor intervals. Now, similarly, if we take our minor interval, okay, and again we want to shorten that by a half step. We want to go down or decrease it by a semitone, okay? Okay, this is what we call creating a diminished interval, okay? And we can do this as well with perfect intervals. So if we take our perfect fifth and we decrease that distance by a half step, we get a diminished fifth. Okay, so a diminished interval is a minor or a perfect interval that is shortened by the distance or the space of a half step or a semitone, okay? When you shorten a perfect or a minor interval by a half step or a semitone, you get diminished interval, okay? So, for example, major third, minor third, diminished third, okay? Perfect fourth, diminished fourth. Perfect fifth, diminished fifth. Okay, octave, perfect octave, diminished eighth. Okay, theoretically, that's correct, and I'm sure what you're starting to observe now is that there's overlap between the different intervals. Your diminished eighth would be your major seventh. Okay, your diminished third will be your major second. Okay, that's going to be important later on when you're adding color to your music and you're playing around with chord voicings and such, and you realize the relationship between these notes and these different kinds of chords help you to build up your melody and build up your harmony in such a way that it works in the music and it adds color to the songs. Okay. So lastly, I'm going to cover the augmented intervals, the last interval in our chromatic series of intervals, okay? And this is different, okay? Instead of decreasing the distance or shortening the distance of the interval by a half step, we're going to increase the distance by a half step, okay? And simply put, an augmented interval is when you increase a major interval or a perfect interval by a half step or by a semitone, okay? So if we take our major third in the key of C and we increase that by a half step, we have an augmented third, okay? We've got our perfect perfect fourth in the key of C. Okay, we increase that by a half step, you have an augmented fourth, okay? Perfect fifth, augmented fifth. Major sixth, augmented sixth. Major seventh, augmented seventh. So depending on the context and how you use it, different intervals can be called different things at the same time. You know, this is both an augmented sixth and a minor seventh interval. Okay, just as an example. So it's going to be something that you guys should play around with, and this is just for your understanding. This video is something to watch again. It will help you to understand the foundational concepts of pairing notes together, and it's going to become really important when we move on to our next video when we start looking at building chords, okay, and how to build different kinds of chords. We're going to look at 2-noted chords, 3-noted chords, 4-noted chords, and kind of just explain that. And then as we start to move some of these intervals around, we'll see how that affects the chords we build as we go on in the series. The first interval is our unison. The second interval is our major second. The third interval is our major third. Fourth interval is our perfect fourth. Fifth interval is our perfect fifth. Sixth interval is our major sixth. Seventh interval is our major seventh. And the eighth interval is octave. Okay, and you can notice that there are different octaves up and down the keyboard. This keyboard has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 octaves.